The wind howled across the open plains of Chestnut Ridge, whispering secrets through the brittle grass and dry fence posts. Out here, where the earth cracked from heat and silence, folks either kept their heads down, or disappeared. In the early hours of dawn, just as the sky flirted with a thin line of gold, a woman sat motionless on the porch of the Caldwell estate, barefoot, bruised, and shivering beneath a gray shawl too thin for the cold. Her name was Mara Caldwell, and though she was only 34, her face wore the exhaustion of a life 3 times that age. Inside the grand house, where velvet drapes filtered in sunlight and the fireplace still smoldered from the night before, her husband Grant Caldwell poured himself a glass of brandy. It was barely past 6 in the morning. To the outside world, Grant was a gentleman, refined, educated, charming at town meetings. But behind the polished oak doors, his charm rotted into something crueler. Something calculated. Mara coughed into her shawl, blood staining the linen. Her lungs were giving out, doctors had called it consumption, though no one dared say the word terminal aloud. In truth, her body had begun the slow march toward death nearly a year ago, and Grant had grown impatient with her weakness. He didn't beat her with fists, no, that would be too crude for a man of his stature. He used silence like a whip, neglect like poison. But sometimes, when the brandy ran hot in his veins and the world outside had failed to please him, Grant would drag her by the wrist, push her to the floor, his words through clenched teeth like, "You were supposed to be the perfect wife." Or worse. She could no longer remember what it felt like to be loved. Out in the stable, a large white horse stood still among the shadows. His name was Solace, and he had once belonged to Mara's father, a kind rancher from Wyoming who had died 5 winters ago. Solace had been her wedding gift, though now, like Mara, he'd been forgotten, fed only enough to survive, never groomed, never ridden. But Solace remembered. He remembered how Mara used to braid ribbons into his mane, how her laughter had once danced through the barn like light through the rafters. He had not heard that sound in years. Still, every morning, as the wind swept through the valley, Solace stood facing the house, unmoving, watching. He had seen the bruises. He had heard the sobs behind closed doors. He had smelled the blood in the laundry hung behind the kitchen. And this morning, Solace watched as Mara slipped off the porch and fell to her knees on the frostbitten ground. She stayed there for a long time, her fragile frame hunched like an abandoned child, coughing into her palms until the morning swallowed her whole. Chestnut Ridge was the kind of town where no one asked too many questions. People knew Grant Caldwell was rich, that he donated to the church, that he sent crates of wine to the mayor's home during the holidays. So when Mara disappeared from social gatherings, they assumed illness had taken her to bed. When she stopped showing up entirely, they assumed she had already died, and simply hadn't been buried yet. No one asked. No one looked. But the horse in the stable knew. And he never stopped watching. That night, a storm rolled in over the ridge. Mara lay curled up on a torn blanket near the hearth, too weak to climb the stairs. Grant didn't offer help. Instead, he stood at the window, glass in hand, watching the lightning crack open the sky. Without turning around, he said coldly, "You should have died months ago. You're just dragging it out now." Mara closed her eyes. Solace, from the stable across the muddy yard, neighed once, loud and sharp. No one had heard him like that in years. Mara opened her eyes. A flash of lightning lit the room. And in that moment, she knew. She wasn't truly alone. The storm had passed by morning, but the air smelled of wet ash and unspoken grief. Clouds hung low, refusing to move on, as if the land itself held its breath. Mara hadn't slept. She lay stiff on the rug by the fire, her lungs rattling with every breath, a thin streak of blood staining her lips. Her arms were wrapped around her midsection, not from cold, but from the ache that pulsed deep inside her ribs. The ache had no name anymore. It was just, always there. From the stable, Solace watched the house like he always did. But this time, something had changed. The wind no longer whispered. It demanded. 2 years ago, Mara had been a different woman. She used to ride Solace through the valley each morning, her long auburn hair braided beneath a sun hat, her hands firm on the reins. She would wave to the neighbors, buy bread from the town baker, and visit the local schoolhouse, where she volunteered to teach children how to read. She was kind, gentle, unshakably hopeful. But it all began to fade after her diagnosis. It was consumption, the doctor said, though he hesitated to say fatal. When Grant found out, he hadn't held her. He hadn't cried. He had only asked, in that ice-slick tone of his, "How long before it ruins you?" And so the rooms grew colder. The silence sharper. The hands that had once touched her gently now shoved, now gripped, now threatened. And slowly, Mara began to vanish. But Solace never forgot who she truly was. Each evening, when Grant was out drinking or conducting business deals in town, Mara would crawl from her bed, limp barefoot to the barn, and press her forehead against Solace's neck. There, in the soft warmth of hay and breath, she could still feel like herself. She never spoke of the beatings, not out loud. But Solace knew. Horses don't need words to understand suffering. Sometimes, Mara brought him sugar cubes from the pantry. Other times, she just brought silence and tears. Solace always listened. And on one of those nights, as thunder rolled in the distance and her hands trembled from fever, she had whispered, "If I die here, Solace, make sure someone knows." In the weeks that followed, Mara's world became smaller. Grant began locking the pantry, restricting her food. He moved her into the downstairs parlor, claiming she was too weak to climb stairs, but really, it was just easier for him not to see her. She wasn't allowed outside anymore. Not even to the barn. But Solace still watched. Every morning, every dusk, every flicker of candlelight that passed the window. He watched as Mara grew thinner. He watched as bruises bloomed like sickly violets along her jawline. He watched her fall and not get up for hours. And one afternoon, something in him shifted. It was subtle at first, restlessness in the hooves. Whinnies that lasted a second longer than usual. A refusal to eat from Grant's hired hand. And then, one evening, he kicked the stall door open. It didn't break, yet. But the message was clear. He was no longer content to just watch. Mara didn't know it yet, but help was coming. Not from the church. Not from the neighbors. Not from any human at all. It would come on 4 legs, with a mane like sunlight and a memory stronger than cruelty. Because some animals remember what humans forget. That loyalty, once forged in kindness, does not die in silence. That night, Mara tried to light a fire and failed. Her hands were shaking too hard. Grant had taken the matches. She curled up near the cold hearth, whispering the Lord's Prayer under her breath, too weak to stand. And in the dark yard, behind a curtain of icy rain, Solace pressed his muzzle to the stable door and let out a sound she hadn't heard in years. A deep, guttural cry, half pain, half warning. It didn't wake Grant. But it woke her. For the first time in weeks, Mara opened her eyes not with dread, but with a spark. And somewhere deep inside her frail chest, something flickered. Not hope. Not yet. But defiance. The great white horse thundered through the muddy yard, hooves slicing through the wet ground like blades. His mane whipped in the wind, glowing ghost-like in the fading light. Windows rattled. The old oak tree by the fence shook. Inside, Mara barely lifted her head. She thought she was dreaming. The front door creaked open, just a little, not from wind, but from the weight of a presence. Solace stood there. His chest heaving, his coat soaked from rain. Rainwater pooled beneath his hooves, but he did not move further in. Mara blinked. The horse stepped forward, just once, and then stopped, as if waiting. And in that moment, something ancient stirred in her memory. Her wedding day. Her father's hands lifting her into Solace's saddle. Her laughter in the summer wind. She tried to sit up but collapsed. Solace let out a low, pained sound and turned swiftly, galloping back into the darkness. She thought he was leaving. But he wasn't. Across the ridge, a lantern glowed in the small sheriff's office of Chestnut Ridge. Sheriff Ansel Tully, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, sat with his boots crossed on the desk, sipping stale coffee. The town was quiet. Too quiet, some might say. He was just closing his eyes for a nap when a sharp knock startled him. Not a knock, really. A hoofbeat. He looked out the window, and nearly dropped his cup. A white horse stood outside the office, wild-eyed, panting, foam dripping from his mouth. His coat was muddy and lathered, and something about his eyes felt urgent. Behind him was Eli, barefoot, breathless, shouting. "Sheriff! You gotta come. It's Miss Mara, he's killing her." The sheriff didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle, called for his deputy, and saddled up within minutes. No questions. He had seen Grant's type before. Too many times. And too many buried women. Meanwhile, Grant Caldwell stumbled home just past midnight. Drunk. Smug. Reeking of bourbon and cigar ash. He opened the door and paused. The parlor was empty. No cough. No wheezing breath. No pale ghost by the hearth. Just silence. He blinked. Mara? He stepped into the room, glass crunching underfoot, fragments of a shattered vase he hadn't noticed earlier. The rug was gone. Her blanket, gone. Her medicine bottle lay broken on the floor. A chill prickled the back of his neck. Then he heard it. A creak from the cellar door. He turned. It was open. Mara was no longer in the parlor. Somehow, by what strength, no one would ever understand, she had dragged herself through the back hallway, crawled down into the damp cellar, and locked the door behind her. There, she lay hidden between crates of old wine and rotting apples, clutching the broken ribbon from Solace's mane in one hand and a small leather notebook in the other. Inside that notebook? Pages and pages of dated entries. Names. Injuries. Days of abuse. Names of doctors who turned her away. Letters Grant had written to a mistress in San Francisco. A forged will. And at the very back, a letter to the sheriff, sealed and dated 5 months prior, never sent. If this reaches you, please know I did not die by illness. Upstairs, Grant stormed toward the cellar, fury blooming in his veins. But before he could descend, headlights flooded the front yard. Horses neighed. Boots hit the ground. Grant Caldwell. Sheriff Tully's voice boomed like thunder. "Step outside with your hands where I can see 'em." Grant froze. He looked to the window. And there, standing tall beside the sheriff's horse, mud-streaked and regal in the moonlight, was Solace. His head high. His gaze steady. His loyalty undeniable. Minutes later, the sheriff's boots echoed down the stairs. They found Mara barely conscious in the cellar, the notebook clutched to her chest. Her voice was weak, but she said only 2 words. "The horse." And then she passed out. Morning broke slowly over Chestnut Ridge. A soft mist blanketed the valley, and for the first time in months, light filtered into the Caldwell estate not with dread, but peace. Inside the sheriff's cabin, Mara lay wrapped in clean quilts. Her breath was faint but steady. The town's nurse, an older woman named Clara Wynne, who had once taught Mara how to sew, tended to her gently, wiping the fever from her brow. She hadn't spoken since they found her. But her grip never loosened around the leather notebook. Outside, Sheriff Tully stood beside his horse, talking quietly with Eli. The boy had stayed through the night, refusing to leave Solace's side. The white horse now stood in the paddock behind the sheriff's barn, eating fresh hay and wearing a borrowed wool blanket. Solace was calm. But alert. He always was. "The doc says she's got maybe weeks left," the sheriff muttered, voice low. "But she's a fighter." Eli nodded. Then added softly. "She never gave up. Not even when everyone else did." "She didn't have to," Tully replied, gazing at the paddock. "Not when that horse was watching." Grant Caldwell's arrest made headlines from Chestnut Ridge to Denver. At first, he denied everything. Said Mara was mad. Delirious. Touched in the head. But then came the notebook. Page after page of documented cruelty. Witness statements from the maid who had fled 5 months earlier. Copies of forged legal documents. A banker's note revealing Grant had tried to sell off Mara's land while declaring her mentally unfit. And, most damning of all, a statement from Eli, swearing under oath that it was Solace who alerted him. Who led him to the sheriff. Who refused to let them ignore what was happening behind the walls of that house. It was unprecedented. A horse, saving a human. But in that courtroom, as the judge turned page after page of Mara's testimony, shaky handwriting, tear-stained letters, no one could deny the truth. A woman had been silenced. A man had lied. And a horse had remembered. 2 weeks later, the court ruled. Grant Caldwell was sentenced to 20 years in prison for aggravated abuse, fraud, and attempted murder. He didn't speak a word as he was led away. Mara was not well enough to attend the trial. But the sheriff delivered the verdict to her personally. "He's gone," he said simply, laying his hat against his chest. "And justice has your name on it." Mara didn't smile. But tears rolled quietly down her cheeks. She turned her head toward the window, where Solace stood beneath the old elm tree, watching her through the glass. Her voice was barely a whisper. He kept his promise. In the last month of her life, Mara asked for only 3 things. To sleep beside the open window. To have Clara read to her from her father's Bible. And to see Solace every morning and every evening. He came, without fail. Rain or shine, hoofs quiet on the grass, his eyes always on her. Sometimes, she would lift a trembling hand toward the glass, and he would step closer, nose brushing the window pane. They didn't need words. Some bonds are too old, too deep for language. When Mara passed, the entire town turned out for her funeral. They buried her beneath the large oak tree on the Caldwell land, now returned to her name. Beside her grave stood Eli, Sheriff Tully, Nurse Clara. And Solace. Draped in a black ribbon, head bowed low, the horse stood still as stone. Not once did he neigh. Not once did he fidget. As if he understood exactly what was happening. At the end of the ceremony, Eli stepped forward, reading from a note Mara had written days before her death. "I lived too long in silence. But I did not die alone. I died watched. Protected. And remembered. By the only soul who never turned away." In the months that followed, Solace was given to Eli, who cared for him as Mara once had. He restored the stable. Painted the fence. Let schoolchildren come and feed Solace apples on Sunday afternoons. A small wooden sign was placed above the barn door. Solace, the horse who told the truth. And under the tree where Mara now rested, wildflowers bloomed early each spring. They said it was the soil. But Eli believed it was her. Life lesson from the story. In a world that too often turns its back on the suffering of the vulnerable, true loyalty doesn't need words, it only needs heart. Solace didn't speak. He didn't fight with fists or laws. But he stood. He remembered. And when the moment came, he acted. The story of Mara and Solace is not just about abuse or injustice. It's about how even in our darkest hour, someone, something, can see us. And that sometimes, salvation has hooves.